Well, welcome everyone to the second episode in the fall series of Centered Life. Um, I'm Jack Fortin. I'm the curator for this series, and want to welcome all of you again today. Recognizing also that each of these series are being recorded so that you can go back we're hoping within 7 to 10 days, each recording of the previous session will be available. As you know, our title for this 4-week series is The Church's Call into the Public Square. And it's the church, by that we mean all of God's people, not just the institution, but all of us who are part of the church. And the challenge is not only understanding that, but really the call to our own individual as well as collective involvement in the public square. The theme for today is the call to accompaniment and interpretation in the second series. So Jeremy and Christina, I want to welcome the two of you as well. And we had a great session last week. As we reflected on it a little bit, or as I have, I realized so much content was given. It was so rich that often for me, I have to step back after such an event, and questions at times come to mind. And I wanted to start this session by asking those of you that have joined us now, were there remaining questions for you, or did something strike you in the last week after kind of ruminating on our time together, in which you maybe want to ask a question or two? And so I'm going to, first of all, invite Jeremy into giving us a bit of a briefing on what went on last week, so that those of you that might have missed it and have not yet been able to get to the recording because it's not yet available, to give a little bit of a background of where we are and introduce today's theme. I think following that, I know there's at least one question that people have, but as you give us a bit of a summary, maybe there'll be other questions from our participants who might want to put it up on the chat. Just a reminder that we do below on your screen, there's an opportunity to respond by your questions. So Jeremy, why don't you, we invite you into giving us a bit of a summary for last week.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. It's nice to be with you all again today. Thanks for the time. Christina and I love whenever we have a chance to talk about this with people rather than just amongst ourselves. We try really hard to not position ourselves as experts, but as people who are curious, and we're trying to we're really eager about inviting other people into this conversation as curious folks as well, as we explore what it looks like to live our faith out in the public square as individuals, but also as faith communities. So thanks for being a part of the conversation. Yeah, I'll try to review real quick what we talked about last week together. So TJ, if you want to go to the next screen, this quote was a quote by Douglas John Hall that I talked about that's been really important to us. The good news is good because it challenges and displaces the bad news. As we as Christians seek to proclaim, enact, participate with the good news of Jesus in the world, we feel deeply here at the Riverside Innovation Hub and the Christensen Center for Vocation at Augsburg that requires us to do the hard work of hearing our neighbor's bad news first, before we can assume that we have good news worth sharing. We want to do the hard work of understanding how our neighbors are encountering bondage, pain, suffering, fear, anxiety, hopelessness, then if we've entered into a relationship with them in a way that they trust us enough to share that story with us, then we might begin to understand what the good news of Jesus would look like or sound like in that place. So if we can click on the next image, this is the public church framework that we're using in the Christensen Center for Vocation with the Riverside Innovation Hub project. Again, it's not rocket science, and we didn't create it. We feel like these are practices people use on a regular basis when they're seeking how to understand something and how to become helpful in a situation. And we call these the art forms. So the first art form is accompaniment, or the movement into our community, the movement into our neighbors' lives, to listen, to get to know our neighbor, to understand our neighbor's lived reality. The second art form is the movement into interpretation, where we begin to think theologically about our neighbor's story, where we allow our theology or our belief in God to shape our understanding of our neighbor's story, and where we allow our neighbor's story to shape our understanding of God. The third art form is the movement into discernment, where we collectively, prayerfully discern how God is inviting us to show up as good news in our neighbors' lives. And then the fourth movement is the Act of Proclamation, where we actually step out to proclaim good news in word and deed. And again, as we said last week, sometimes we're proclaiming or bringing good news into the space, and at other times we're coming alongside of the good news as it's already unfolding in our communities, in spite of the church, in spite of what we've done. So we last week when we were together, we just covered the reasons behind this work, and primarily we want to be clear that this work is not an act of desperation, something the church is only doing because we're in tough times. This is not a magic pill to get people to come back to church, but we believe this is a way of being church that is expressive of that which is true to who God is and that which is true to who we've been created to be as public people seeking to be relational good news out in the public square with our neighbor. And what we're going to do today is we're going to introduce you to these first two art forms, the art form of accompaniment and the art form of interpretation. And we can, if there are questions in the chat, Jack, we can take those now.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Jeremy, for your great summary. And just remind people that Amy Alkire is on. She's the one that's tending to the questions, and feel free to go to the chat for the questions you might have. There was a question from Jim Scheibel from last week that we didn't get to, and so we want to start with this question, just so that people realize we do tend to your questions, and we think this is what creates a depth and understanding when we can interchange with one another in conversation. So the question is, how does the language and concepts of shalom and Jesus proclaiming the kingdom of God is at hand work into the accompaniment process? So that's a mouthful, and I think you deserve to have to answer this one, Jeremy.
I think the concepts of shalom and the kingdom of God being at hand play deeply into the this concept of accompaniment, and I think accompaniment, we're aware of in this project, and someone asked the question last week, how do you do proclamation, or how do you do this without sort of turning it into like a transactional relationship between you and the neighbor, thinking that the neighbor needs something that you have. I think the concepts of shalom, again, this theological idea of shalom and God, the reign of God or the kingdom of God being at hand, should prevent the church from assuming that we contain it, that we hold it, that we have it, that we possess it. And this approach really believes that God's Spirit is already loose in the world and already doing the work of shalom and already doing the work about bringing about God's kingdom. And sometimes the church gets to proclaim that and initiate that, and then other times the church gets to see that it's already happening, and then we get to roll up our sleeves and participate in that work I love the term from within Judaism, tikkun olam, which is a Hebrew phrase which means to mend the universe. That God's work is the mending of the universe, and we get to participate in that. And sometimes it's our hard work that's making it happen. Sometimes it's through our hard work that God makes that happen, and at other times, God's Spirit is doing that in spite of us. And this project is offering up a set of practices that allows the church to, and allows us as individuals to maybe become aware of how God's Spirit is already doing that work in our communities, so that we can celebrate it and participate in it with our neighbors. That's a great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And let's get right into this next session.
All right.
Because you really already are doing a nice job of orienting us to this theme of accompaniment interpretation. And I know, Christina, you've got a few thoughts along this line as well.
Yes. Thank you, Jack. TJ, if you want to move us on to the next slide. And Jim, to your question, I think I would listen for where you hear those things as we talk about accompaniment here this morning or this afternoon. There might be some other layers of your question that this part of the presentation might speak to, and we can kind of touch back on that during the Q&A. So as Jeremy mentioned, he reminded folks about kind of this movement through these 4 art forms, and that today we'll be focused on accompaniment, really just broad brushstrokes about these art forms. So accompaniment, you'll hear a bit from me, and then Jeremy's going to share a bit about interpretation, and next week we'll do the other 2. These are broad brushstrokes because these are art forms. These are going to look different and take on different flavors and different practices, given your context and given the place you live in, the community that your worshiping community is a part of. But we'll try to speak to the essence of these art forms here this morning. So we begin with accompaniment. We find ourselves back in accompaniment in this cycle, and we're continually returning to accompaniment. There's such a significant emphasis on an orientation towards the neighbor in this framework. So this is, I think Jeremy said this last week, when in doubt, like return back into listening for the neighbor's story. That's always a good place to find yourself located in. So what is accompaniment? We'll try to hit on these 3 questions with each art form. What is it? Why is it important? And give some insights on how you might go about participating in it or practicing it in your places. So what is accompaniment? Really, as it's this movement into the community to encounter your neighbors, to encounter the stories of the neighborhood, the bad news, to hear the bad news that's at work, to hear places where the good news is already underway as well. It is not market research. The just showing up out in the community or out in the neighborhood is not. There's a certain posture that comes with accompaniment that is there to listen without the church's agenda, but to be curious about what's going on in the neighborhood. So this isn't asking, about church participation or worship preferences to try to gauge how to cultivate something different in your community, in your worshiping community. Not to diminish that those might be helpful questions to ask in other contexts, but that's not accompaniment. Another concept that's really key to accompaniment is the identification of listening posts. Listening posts are just simply these public spaces and places in our various locations where folks gather, where you're going to have an opportunity to rub shoulders with people that share this community space with you or with your congregation. And again, these will be different depending on each depending on your location and your context. The listening post might be the local coffee shop. It might be a salon or a neighborhood association. It might be the Friday night football games, right? You already know what some of these are likely in your context, and there's probably some that are off your radar. And so the movement into accompaniment into the neighborhood helps us discover and be more curious about these places where we might show up with this posture of listening for the neighbor's story. And again, listening, what are we listening for? We're listening for desolation and consolation. We're listening for bad news that our neighbors are experiencing, and good news that's already at work, so that we might know, or we might gain some clarity or some insight in how we might be equipped as individuals or as congregations to show up in these places and be a part of what God intends for all of us, which is thriving, flourishing, life, and healing. And then the last thing to mention here is we talk about this, all of the art forms really, as both, but in the terms in referencing accompaniment, this is both outreach, but it's also discipleship. So it is an important part of the church experience to be engaged in the neighborhood, to be in relationship, to seek to find new ways to cultivate meaningful, life-giving relationships as a church community that has a particular location and impact on that local area. And we've run into this a number of times with some of the churches we work with, where folks will say, why do we need to do accompaniment in the neighborhood around my church? I live 20 minutes away from here. I don't live in this neighborhood. And what our response is to that is that yes, and participating in this art form, participating in this kind of community orientation towards the neighbor and listening in the neighborhood. If we do this as Christian community, this is how we teach, equip, gain confidence, gain curiosity, to be able to do this in our own lives, right? So that's the discipleship component. That as we do this as Christian community, we're also equipping our folks and our congregations to embody this same kind of curiosity and openness to the world around them in that place where they live 20 minutes away from the church. So we can move on to the next.
I'm gonna hop in real quick and I just want to acknowledge the fact that our numbers all say 1, which is sort of a funny thing. It happened when the slides transferred over, but I also like the fact that it just shows you that all of these things are just as important as the next one. So there's my attempt to make lemonade out of lemons.
Almost like we planned it that way, right? So there are so many things that both Jeremy and I could say about accompaniment, and we're trying to just pick up some of the key components here. One thing there's 2 things I want to say about why accompaniment is important. There's kind of 2 elements. There's multiple reasons why it's important, but so let me illustrate those with these 2 photos here. The first aspect here is that we can show up in community, we can show up in our neighborhoods, we can show up in the public square and not be accompanying. We can show up with good intentions. We can show up with an interest in like serving or doing good work in our neighborhoods, and we actually can be causing more harm or participating in furthering bad news in the neighborhood if we skip this deep listening for what the neighbor's story is. If we do this, if we show up in the neighborhood with a hope to proclaim good news in some way without a read on the specific particularities of that community, we might totally miss the mark and miss it in damaging ways. And my example of this, Barbara Kingsolver is one of my favorite authors. Many of you have maybe read some of her books. Poisonwood Bible is a fairly well-known one. So if you know the story, you probably already know where I'm going with this picture of the crocodile in the river here, but just the book essentially is about the Price family. And in the 1950s, they're a missionary family, and they moved to the Congo, the Belgian Congo, and and want to start a church and want to, proclaim good news in this village. And when they arrive, they don't really make any effort to get to know their context or the villagers there, their stories or their hopes or their fears. They just come in because they have good news to share. And in their efforts to proclaim this good news of Jesus and invite people into the story, the family, they're bringing people down to the river. They're saying, come to the river. We're going to baptize you. You can enter into this beautiful promise that God has for you and for your life. And the villagers are very fearful and very resistant, because in their context, this river has been a dangerous place. Children have been snatched from the banks by creatures that murk in the waters there. Folks have been swept away by the current, never to be seen again. So this is not good news to them in the way it's being presented, because there wasn't the time to dig into getting to know what this neighborhood was about. And unfortunately, I have a very local, modern example of this here in the Twin Cities, when just over a year ago, following the murder of George Floyd, quite a few folks began gathering at the intersection where this murder took place, and coming there to lament and to grieve and to be in community and to be together and to cry out in sadness and in anger. And it drew a lot of attention and a lot of people. And some of the folks that showed up there didn't really know those folks and what their real bad news was. So there were some folks from a suburban church that showed up with a baptismal font. And obviously you can guess by that, they were not Lutheran, but showed up with a baptismal font thinking this would be a way to respond to the bad news, but they didn't really take time to listen and hear what that bad news was. So the point being, we can show up and we can do this work to be out in the neighborhood and try to seek relationships. But if we do it without this posture of accompaniment and listening, and holding our own agendas off to the side so that we can actually hear, we risk stepping in and doing the opposite, really, of what I think folks in Christian communities hope to be able to do in relationship with one another. The other example then is, well, this public square is too messy and it's too complicated and I might do the wrong thing and it sounds like a lot of work. Let's just not. Let's just avoid it and stay in our safe space. The downside of this, of course, is that you're cutting off a lifeline to this vibrant, complex part of the ecosystem that your church community is indeed a part of. And doing so stifles the growth, the evolving that might happen for a community of faith if it loses its connection to the community that it's in. So my example of this draws on my elementary school days and a science experiment. Maybe some of you did something similar to this, but we had all these paper cups with different plants in them. And we were learning about living systems and how these different components work together to cultivate life and growth. And so we had one little plant that was planted in soil and put by the windowsill in the sun, and we watered it every day. And then we had another little plant that was put in the windowsill in the sun, but we didn't water it. And then we had one that we put in the back room without any sunlight, but we gave it water. And another one that sat back there and we just forgot about it. we didn't water it. We didn't pay any attention to it. And you all know enough to know how that, experiment ended up, right? But just to illustrate the importance of being, we are part of the same ecosystem. Our congregations, the neighborhoods, the local businesses, the schools, the watershed district, all of these things are part of an ecosystem. And if we cut ourselves off from this lifeline of connection, we will atrophy and grow less and less relevant or able to be faithful in relevant ways. I had another thought, but I think I lost it. So we'll just move on to the next slide. So when we are able to show up in the neighborhood with this open posture, with this listening, curious, wondering where God's at work, wondering where there's bad news, leaving our agendas behind, taking some risks to show up there, knowing we might goof up in some way. We might not do it exactly the best way we could. But when we take those risks and when we show up, what emerges are these things: connection, community, relationship, understanding, transformation, joy. These are the things that Christians are called to be about. This illustrates the love and the life of Jesus alive and well in community and across these relationships. This word bubble here was created by some churches that are in our current project, as we just finished a workshop with them on accompaniment and what is it that comes out of accompaniment. And these are the things that we're after. These are the things that that demonstrate, that embody, that create space for the kind of relationship and community that God intends for us. And I think we might have a story next. So the next slide. Oh no, I have one more thing to say before Jeremy gets to tell you a story. Sorry, Jeremy. So we've talked a little bit about what accompaniment is. We've talked a little bit about why it's important, and that if we lean into this, the risk of this, the unknown of this way of showing up, that we get to experience some of these things that God intends for us and for our neighbors. Oh, I remembered the thing I was going to share earlier. We have a pastor in one of our churches who made this shift that I've found really helpful. We spend a lot of time talking about vitality in our congregations, in our church settings, what makes for a vital congregation, right? And she said, maybe what we should be after is figuring out how we become a vital neighbor in this place that we are a part of. How are we a vital neighbor to the watershed or the local business community or the folks that share the blocks and streets around our worship space? And that's really what this shift is about, is discovering how to be a vital neighbor and in relationship with the ecosystem of this neighborhood of which we are part of, which we believe and have witnessed brings about mutual flourishing. This is the little plant in the windowsill that's getting water and getting sunlight and bearing fruit. So then how do we practice accompaniment? I'm afraid I'm going to be super vague right now, again, because this is contextual. This is going to look different. It's going to have different flavors and different ways that it gets practiced or embodied, given the specific particular context that you are in, both your worshiping community and you as an individual. But some things just to kind of generally talk about, what are some of the ways that you can help members of your congregations find or create listening posts, these places where we can gather, these places where we can rub shoulders, these places where we might be able to kind of get a pulse on the neighborhood. In the neighborhood where I live, one of those places is the playground down the street. There's often a lot of folks there where you can just kind of get a pulse and get the vibe of the neighborhood and maybe begin to like spark some curiosity around what God might be up to. Putting yourselves in places where you can hear neighbors' stories, joys, concerns, celebrations. Again, this is going to look different in different contexts, but sometimes this can be really intentional ways that we set about to go listen to folks and ask them some questions and set up, an invitation into a conversation. Who are the folks in your neighborhood that care about the things your church cares about? Is there someone at the school you could talk to that's down the block? Is there a business owner who, runs the local coffee shop? or maybe a different organization that's providing services in the community, and asking them about their hopes. What are their hopes for this neighborhood and this community? What are their fears? What breaks their heart? And really setting up space to just have some really honest conversation, to listen and to hear. We have one church that went about doing their accompaniment work that was in our first partnership. And they were talking to these types of people in their community, and they discovered there were a group of people that were hosting something called transformative circles. They were essentially a hosting space, listening posts for where accompaniment was happening out in the neighborhood, and they were inviting folks from all different cross sections of the community to come together and share stories and share hopes and share fears about their neighborhood, and just like stewarding a space for this kind of very intentional conversation. So here this group of folks from this congregation was able to participate in where this accompaniment and this space for hearing people's good news and bad news was already being very thoughtfully tended to. And the last thing I'll say here, and then Jeremy's going to share a story that demonstrates this from one of our churches, because stories are always helpful to open up our imaginations. But simply just walking your neighborhood, right, with this posture of curiosity of where's their good news, where's their bad news. We like to talk about it. Where's their desolation? Where's their consolation? And just paying attention. This can be a really low-hanging fruit, like non-threatening way to begin to kind of uncover some of the potential places to be participating in the neighborhood, or to be practicing accompaniment in the neighborhood. Just moving through the neighborhood. We have our churches do this. It's one of the very first activities or kind of assignments that they take on together, and just walk like a mile or a few block radius around the congregation and just notice, and then come back and reflect on what they saw, what they experienced, what sparked their curiosity. Maybe some of those listening posts emerge, and you get to kind of keep pulling that thread of where we might invest our time and energy in this kind of listening, in this kind of open posture of listening for bad news and good news in the neighborhood. And with that, I'll let Jeremy share a story that illustrates this from one of our churches.
Maybe before, Jeremy, before you share your story, just to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, we are going to do that after the story, Jack, if that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, because we're going to tell one more story about accompaniment, and then we have some questions planned in, or time for questions.
Perfect.
Yeah, no problem. TJ, there we go. This is a pretty picture of a beautiful church. The church you see here on the right side of this picture, the church you see in both pictures, the people on the left, the building on the right, is St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which is now St. Luke's and St. James. Two Episcopal churches have merged in South Minneapolis. St. Luke's has been a partner of ours for the last 4 years. And we're kind of resistant or maybe confused about accompaniment at the beginning of this project, and didn't really know why they needed to do it. They didn't really want to do it in the neighborhood where the church was, because they the members of their team lived in other neighborhoods. So they were like, well, why do we need to do it in this neighborhood when I live over in that neighborhood? So they kind of dragged their heels. They weren't super excited about doing it. But eventually they moved into it. And I want to just tell you briefly their story, because I think it gives you a good example of what this work looks like and why it's so important. So you can see they have this gorgeous red door on the front of their sanctuary, which I don't know if this is true, but I think I've heard something about red doors symbolizing hospitality or something like that, kind of like you're welcome here. And so when they started with us in this project, one of the members of their team said, our goal was really clear when we entered this project. We wanted to get more people coming through those red doors. Those red doors, it was like a big bullseye, and we wanted more people coming through those doors, and we were going to do this public church framework, and we were going to get more people coming in through these doors. And that was their goal. That was their reason for doing it. So then when we started to ask them to practice accompaniment and listen, it just felt like busy work to them. Well, we don't want to do that work. We want to just start getting more people in our building. But then they agreed they would try it. They own a parking lot. This church owns a parking lot. This is a very dense urban neighborhood. They own a parking lot. And there's people who live in an apartment building that use the parking lot. There was a local coffee shop around the corner that used the parking lot. And there was going to be some construction happening on the main road through that neighborhood. And they needed to have a meeting and figure out some things about how this parking lot was going to be used. And they thought, well, maybe this parking lot is an excuse for us to host a listening post. Like, we're going to have a neighborhood meeting about the parking lot, and maybe we can do it at this coffee shop. And so they planned this meeting at the coffee shop to talk with the neighbors about how to best use the parking lot. Not a very exciting reason to have a meeting, but a reason to meet your neighbor anyway. And so they hosted this meeting at the coffee shop, and one of the team members just felt a need to go out on the sidewalk and start inviting people in. And he just went out and started drawing people who were walking by into the coffee shop. Hey, we're having this conversation about the neighborhood, come on in. And more people poured in, and they ended up having this really energizing conversation, not really about the parking lot, but about the neighborhood, and about the fact that this coffee shop was closing, and about the fact that this coffee shop was a local place where people gathered and interacted with one another, and they were worried about losing that public space in their neighborhood. And so the church realized, out of creating this listening post, by doing what they thought they were creating a listening post, but really what they had stumbled upon was the fact that the coffee shop was a listening post, and the neighborhood was going to lose that listening post. And so then the church realized maybe the role it needs to play in the neighborhood is to create a new public space where people can bump up against each other and gather together. And so on the left side of this picture, you can see kind of what they moved things out into their front yard. So they put some Adirondack chairs out there, some picnic tables out there. They created a little free library. They created a free food shelf. They started serving ice cream out on their front yard on Sunday mornings after church. And their front yard has now become like a front porch for the church and a gathering space for the neighborhood. So they thought at the beginning that their goal was to bring a bunch of people in through these red doors. And they realized through accompaniment that actually the goal was to get their people to go out the red doors into the neighborhood. And they were hesitant to do that, but because they started listening to their neighbors, they began to realize it was their neighbors who were calling them out of the church and into the front yard. And they wouldn't have realized that if they hadn't taken the risk of starting to try to listen to their neighbors through accompaniment. So that's a little story of how we've seen this happen in a real church. And yeah, we can take some questions right now about accompaniment, and then we'll transition into the next art form, which is interpretation.
So we're looking to see if any of you can bring some questions into the chat room. Be great. One just from Elaine Eschbacher. She it's not a question, but I think she was underlining something, Elaine, that I think is important, and that is this whole framework is talking about art forms, and rather than it being top down, I mean, you both have described it so well, but I just think keeping it in the realm of art forms allows it to really be creative and innovative. There isn't a one way to do any of it. And you're saying the context can dictate how that takes place. And your story most recently is exactly that, that people still really wanting people come to church. I mean, that's such a huge thing where I've identified the church with the institution on the corner versus God's people being the church. It's a hard movement. One of the things that I heard along the way, Christina, you were talking about, just briefly, you said transformation. And I think that's a word kicked around a lot, but it's been helpful for me to unpack that word a little bit and to realize that transformation is kind of the third order of change, in which the assumptions by which I do my work are being challenged. Not that I'm doing them differently or I have a new program to keep doing the same old thing, but transformation is kind of an awakening to my assumptions and having them challenged. And here's a beautiful example of that in your story of a church that's really transformed. And that's not some big, four-syllable word. It's a reality. The assumptions by which the church is working is differently. It's happening differently. What if it'd be wonderful if our pastors would actually initiate this in communities. And I know we have several pastors on today who are deeply interested in continuing to do this kind of work. But you're a person that's a member of a church, and the church itself, the institution, doesn't seem to have an interest. Do you have any words for how one would go about taking just personal initiative in their community to do God's work in that community? How might that happen so that you're not waiting for this, again, to be a institutional program? Now we're all going to go out in the street and get to know our neighbors versus keeping it from being such a formalized thing, but at the same time having some guidelines around how one might do that. Any thoughts on that when you're a member of a church and maybe this is not a primary?
Yeah, I think the kind of to tie that question in with Elaine's comment about the art forms is really important to us, that we want people to understand what we mean by accompaniment, and we want people to understand some ways you could maybe practice it. But if we come in as like in a consultant role and we tell you to do these three things and write a report for us, that's going to keep this whole process very sterile, and I think prevent transformation. But if we keep it loose and open and talk about these as art forms, then the ministry leaders, pastors, lay leaders, whoever it might be, we have to work with our congregation to figure out how will we practice accompaniment? What does it look like for us? How can we do that given our assets and our limitations? And so this whole thing is intended to be organic. We want you to understand what accompaniment is, but we want you to do the work of figuring out how you're going to practice it in your community, and even taking the step, that's slow work. That is slow work. But taking the time to do that slow work with your faith community is a formative experience for your faith community. Now your people, because you're asking those questions as a faith community, then the people who are part of your congregation, your faith community, are learning how they would do that in their own homes as a family, in their own neighborhoods. If you as a church are gathering to say, how will we practice accompaniment here as a congregation, then your people are learning how to ask that same question of their families at home in their neighborhoods. And so if we come in and tell you how to do it, we've missed the transformative opportunity.
And I'll just add that our fourth and final session with you all will be a shift to that very question, Jack, and thinking on the more like, okay, now what are the takeaways that might actually bring some life and some curiosity into your own specific contexts, whether you're a leader in a community somewhere, in a congregation somewhere, or participate as a member somewhere. So we'll be able to nuance that a little bit more at our fourth and final session.
Well, thanks for a reminder that that will happen. But it's good for us, I think, along the way to keep it in front of us. Kind of what is my circumstance right now? I really liked, Jeremy, your notion too that it can begin in the family itself. Mm-hmm. How do we accompany one another? So how do we really listen to our own family members, the stories? Like you, I spent a lot of my time with adolescents. My whole first 20 years of my life was youth ministry. And you discover how much healing goes on just when you listen to young people's stories. They just so eager to tell them. And you go, yeah. I wonder why this can't happen in families. Why does it have to always happen outside? Yeah.
I think it's I think young people assume adults don't want to listen to them. And I think most of the world today, most of our society today, most of folks who aren't showing up at church today assume the church doesn't want to listen to them.
Yeah. Really. And hence the loss of membership because of that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in hearing how interpretation comes into play now with this.
Yeah.
What do we do with what we've learned? Yeah.
Yeah. And before I segue, I do want to, if I can turn I have this lovely office that looks out on the community garden here at Augsburg. If you can see that, I just turned my laptop so you can see out my window. There's this beautiful community garden there. And I think that's another example of this whole process. Like, Augsburg didn't do the public church framework to decide to plant a garden there, but Augsburg planted a garden or built this community garden for lots of reasons. It reflects the values of the university. It says something about those values. It creates, and it also creates a place where the university can be engaged with the neighborhood and continue to be transformed by the relationship with the neighborhood. So it's both an expression of or a proclamation of our core values as an institution, and it simultaneously creates an opportunity where we can continue to be challenged by and transformed by relationship with our neighbors. So this community garden here at Augsburg, I would say, is another example of what this looks like, what this whole thing looks like. And TJ, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I'm going to talk about interpretation for a few minutes. So again, in this framework, you do this listening of your neighbor and you're gathering these stories, and these are going to be heartbreaking and heartwarming stories. But then I think we do, as Christians, we have a call to make sense of those stories. And the call to make sense of those stories is the call to do theology. And by that, I mean what Douglas John Hall talks about, the work of discerning what the good news will be that will actually displace my neighbor's bad news. That's what we're talking about here in interpretation, is thinking theologically, thinking about things in light of God's promises. So interpretation, after the movement into the neighborhood, interpretation is the movement into your faith community's core theological convictions. And every faith community has different core theological convictions. You might have certain theological claims that are really important to you. You might have certain components of the biblical narrative that are really important to you. And those begin to shape your imagination. They begin to shape your view of the world. So for example, I used to serve St. Philip's Lutheran Church up in Fridley. That was my first job out of college. I was a youth minister up there. And while I was there, the pastor who I was working under latched on to the name St. Philip's. And we were named after Philip, from Philip and Nathaniel in the New Testament. And Philip was the one who said to Nathaniel, "Come and see." And so that biblical story became a really powerful interpretive lens for our staff as we imagined our ministry. What does it mean to be the church that says, "Come and see"? And so we latched onto a component of the biblical narrative as a core conviction for us that shaped the way we thought about our ministry. What does it mean to be a church that says, "Come and see"? So it's this movement out. It's this movement back into our faith community's core convictions. It's seeking to understand how our core beliefs about God enlighten the way we understand our neighbor's story. And it's also the invitation to allow our neighbor's story to push back against some of our beliefs about God and maybe challenge those or expand those. And again, I like to talk about this model as being both outreach and discipleship. Many people hear it as just, oh, this is about outreach. This is about reaching out to the community. It's about reaching out into the community, but it's also about helping the members of our congregations learn how to think theologically about and ultimately discern vocation or discern call. This is really, so in a way, this is about discipleship, forming people to move through their daily lives in a way that to help people learn how to move through their daily lives in a way that they're constantly wondering about what God's up to. What is God doing in this place? How is God inviting me and calling me to be present with my neighbor in this place? So it's both outreach. The interpretive move here is about outreach and also discipleship. If we can go to the next slide. This is just an image of lots of really pretty glasses, eyeglasses. And it really getting back to this idea of the art forms, and there's no right way to do this. We are not in the business of projecting a theological view or a set of theological convictions onto a congregation. We believe that's the pastoral staff's work with the members of that congregation to identify those core convictions that shape their view. But this idea of a collection of eyeglasses that, if I take these off, I don't see as well. If I put my glasses on, I see better. And so what are the things that shape my glasses? What are the things that help me see the world better? What are the elements of God's promises that help me see clearly? And the elements of God's promises that help me see clearly are going to probably be different than the elements of God's promises that help you see clearly. There's probably some similarities too. But again, doing the hard, slow relational work of helping your people identify the framework, the lenses that they use to interpret the world is a gift. Most people don't have the opportunity to sit with people they trust and respect and wonder together about the things that shape their view of reality. That's a formative experience. If we tell them how to think about the world, we're missing a transformational moment. We're missing an opportunity to help these people, again, learn how to view their world in light of God's promises. And we're all going to see that differently. We don't all have the same prescriptions. We all have very different prescriptions. If we can go to the next slide, another thing we like to talk about when we talk about these art forms, rather than giving you best practices, we like to give you best questions. So we don't want to tell you the best ways to practice interpretation because we think it's important for you and your community to figure out how to do that. But we can give you best questions. And what we mean by these are questions that we think your faith community should be working towards answering. How you do it is up to you, but we do think these are the questions you should be chasing after. So let me just read these off to you. What are your faith community's most important claims about God and God's work in the world? How do you as the leader, as an individual, get people to the answer? That's up to you. But we think this is a question that is worth chasing after with folks. Number 2, how do these claims impact the way we think about our neighbors' stories? Number 3, how do their stories, our neighbors' stories, impact the way we think about our claims? Number 4, where do we hear and see despair in our community? And number 5, where do we hear and see hope in our community? And this practice of looking for hope and despair, or what Christina said earlier, she was using the term consolation and desolation. These terms come from Saint Ignatius, right? The Ignatian Awareness Examen is a way that Ignatius prayed on a daily basis, looking over his day. At the end of each day, he would pray looking over his day, looking for moments of desolation or brokenness, times he experienced brokenness, fear, anxiety, pain. And then he would also look over his day for times and moments, places where he experienced consolation, healing, hope, forgiveness. So Ignatius had this practice every day of looking for consolation and desolation in his life and how God was present in those things. And we want congregations to develop this practice as well. Where do they see consolation? Where do they see desolation in their neighborhood? Where do they see consolation in their neighborhood? Where do you see hope? How do you hear hope in your neighborhood? How do you hear despair in your neighborhood? Because we believe they're both present. We believe both of those things are always present, and that God is always at work in those places and in those moments. And I'm going to pass the baton back to my friend Christina, who's going to now share with you a story about from one of our congregations and the work they did around interpretation.
Thanks, Jeremy. And you can move to the next slide, TJ. So we have a visual to accompany our story. So the photo here I'll describe, and then I'll share a bit of the story, but you can see there's a whiteboard with a lot of multicolored Post-it notes, kind of all connected with arrows and dots and things kind of worked out. And if you're like me, I would have loved to have been in the room as people were putting all these different nuggets and stories and things together. But I've heard a bit about what it was like for those on this congregational team who were there and who did this interpretive work together. This comes from Trinity Lutheran Congregation, which is actually one of our neighbors here in the neighborhood, Cedar Riverside, where Augsburg is located. Small little church. They have not had a building for decades because of the realities of living in an urban context, and so they worship out of the chapel here at Augsburg. And this context is incredibly diverse. So many different languages and cultures represented here. It's a landing place for a lot of immigrants coming to the U.S. And so we're a very interreligious, intercultural, urban setting that Trinity is a part of. And so this exercise that led to their interpretation work together as a team began with their accompaniment work, began with them identifying folks in this Cedar Riverside neighborhood that cared about some of the things they cared about. And they set out to collect these stories and ask these questions with folks around here in this neighborhood, listening for where their hearts were breaking and where they were having hopes and where they were experiencing brokenness. And so after they did that work, they scheduled this time to come back together as a team, and they put all those different stories and things that they were reflecting on together on different Post-it notes and started mapping them out on the board. And then they asked some theological questions of one another. They asked, what are the names that we use for God that show up over and over again in this congregation, in worship, in our conversations? How do we name God in this place? What are the Bible stories that really resonate here, that maybe get lifted up or maybe are reflected in the artwork or get embodied in different rituals or things we do as a worshiping community? I mean, these are questions that you don't need Masters of Divinity or any kind of theological higher education to dig into. These are questions that we can all ask and reflect on together. And so they started collecting these nuggets of ideas and stories about how God's story really is present and is shaping their imagination for what God's up to. And they put all these up on the board. And another component really of this interpretive move is kind of, in creating this lens, right, this theological lens of how we understand God's promises to be at work in the world, and having this reflection on some of the stories that were heard in the neighborhood, and then just beginning to wonder how they are in conversation with one another. And this was the result of that interpretive exercise that they did together. And they looked for patterns. They looked for things that surprised them, that caught their attention. They realized that the theme in the neighborhood was that hearts were breaking for young East African men who were struggling with the opioid crisis in our neighborhood, and folks that were engaging in that work. And what does that mean in light of God's promises to be the hands and feet, to be participating in God's love and God's healing in the world. And these things all kind of work together towards a focus really for them that then set them up for what we'll talk about next week, which is discernment. Given what we've heard, given what we've experienced, who is God calling us to be and what is God calling us to do? But this interpretive move is really important in laying out the God story that's at play in our congregational lives, in our own lives, and the stories that are at play in our neighborhood, and wondering what they mean then as they speak to one another, and how they can help us as people of faith kind of go deeper into discerning what does this mean now for us, given what we've heard and what we've seen. So that is Trinity, and there's much more to their story, but maybe you'll get glimpses of it next week as we move into discernment and proclamation. Is there anything else you want to add on interpretation, Jeremy, or I think we're close to opening it up for questions and other comments.
Yeah, no, there's nothing else I want to add. Let's open it up to questions about interpretation specifically, or if you have questions about accompaniment. I had one comment or one question come in from a participant about kind of the male, like a lot of the examples we're giving are male-centered examples. I wanted to address that. I asked if I could address that to the whole group because I think it's a great question, and I imagine other people would have interest in hearing this. And it's also really important. It's an important thing to say because it's vital to model that we're doing. And it gets into some. I feel like I'm getting into a little bit of the weeds here with the model, but the starting point, starting with accompaniment. Accompaniment is a practice that's getting more and more attention right now across the church, across Christianity, as a pushback against and an alternative to what has been seen as oppressive, colonizing work of church missions. And a lot of the literature around accompaniment is being written by voices who are generally marginalized, so people of color. A lot of liberation theology, a lot of feminist theology, and a lot of womanist theology is informing the whole idea of starting with accompaniment. By that, meaning that starting in relationship, starting in listening, starting by showing up and being present, rather than walking into the room as if you are in charge. As I teach, I noticed this the other day when I was teaching my Religion 100 class here, how often we talk, like the Bible, the narrative of the Bible is very paternalistic. But if you read through Scripture, the ones who really have a lot of the power, the ones who are really making things, I don't think they have a lot of power, but they're the ones who are making things happen, are the women throughout Scripture. Because the women throughout Scripture are the ones who are showing up. The women are the ones who are doing the work. The women are the ones who are doing the listening. The women are the first ones to show up at the tomb. And Mary becomes the prime example of what it means to practice accompaniment. Mary, Mary, who's referred to as the bearer of God, the one who bears God. So Mary took the risk of showing up and practicing accompaniment to the fullest extent. And so the question was a great question, and I wanted to just say that we really see this project as trying to be a counter to a lot of practices that the church has adopted that have come from colonialism and Christendom, and this assumption that we can show up and fix the problem. The intention is really to start on the ground. So I'll stop there and see if there are other questions.
This is not so much a question, but just an affirmation. It comes from Suzanne Swanson that's with us today. And she says, I live in a neighborhood that is about 18 years old, and there's a front porch on every house. My understanding is that the developers wanted to build a neighborhood community, not a subdivision. The people who live here seem to embody this in their lives. The homes are close together, small yards, and friendly folks. We just moved here in April, and I've had so many conversations, more than I ever had in my previous neighborhoods. This intentionality is so critical. And I think she's pointing up to one of the statements that one of the two of you made along the way is, how do we understand the place that we're in? And, probably over time, one of the challenges is some places are not friendly. A lot of places promote isolationism. And I think part of the task is helping the place in which we inhabit be more conducive to what's going on. So I appreciate Suzanne Swanson's. I want to ask a second question. That has to do with theology. People get so overwhelmed by the word, and really just means God talk, talking about God. And I think you're helping us see that we can reflect theologically, as you say, Christina, without a Master's of Divinity degree. We all are theologians in the sense that we're trying to figure out how God's story and our story intersect, right? And I was reminded at World Vision, when I was a part of that organization, I asked the founder, kind of what's so important about the work that World Vision is doing around the world. And he said, what's most important is that we learn how to let our heart be broken by the things that break the heart of God. And if that's going on, and we can actually know that that's happening, we're motivated to make a difference. And to me, that's a big theological statement. And yet it's just let my heart be broken by the things that I think break the heart of God would be one of those simple ways that you're talking about. But anyway, can you speak a little bit more so that, because you're talking about core convictions rather than core values, so you're bringing some other language in, and any further comments you want to make about that?
Well, I'm sure Jeremy has some things to share. I wanted to insert one thing, though. I think to emphasize the importance of wading into these theological wonderings with folks and in our community, especially in our church communities, because it's very possible to do really thoughtful accompaniment work in the neighborhood and then skip right into making a decision about what to do.
Okay.
And so this pause, interpretation is actually creating some space to pause, right? And not just enter into making a decision or choosing a direction or choosing a response that's coming uncritically, unexamined, or impulsively, maybe without giving us the space to pause and say, well, what do we really? And I don't know, maybe Jeremy would have a different way. I do think values is another angle to think about. what are the things that really matter to who we say God is and who we understand God to be. Because let's think about this thoughtfully through the things that really matter before just jumping into, we're eager to take action. We're eager to get things done. And this helps us pause and do that thoughtfully and hopefully in line with things that are true and that matter.
Well, that's really important.
Yeah, I would say, I like all of that. What I run into sometimes with students here is, and I'm going to tell a story about my students because I think it's true for all of us. They will quite often stay in the area of convictions and values, probably even more values, because they don't feel equipped or like they've been given permission to say anything about God. And if they list a value, I try and push them on that so that it actually becomes a theological statement about God or about who we are in light of God. And I think it's really important for us to do that work, have that conversation with our people, to not just talk about values, but to try and talk about those values as theological claims, things we believe about God, or things we believe about ourselves because of God. That changes the conversation because now we're actually wondering about God collectively together. And if we only talk about values, then not that values are wrong. I'm not saying it's bad to talk about values, but I do think it's important for people to have a chance to talk about the things we say are true about God and whether or not those actually impact our lives.
Great. Well, we're getting close here to the end already. Time goes so fast, I think. One of the lingering things I want to really think about between now and next week is this tension that you're saying that is so important between consolation and desolation, between hope and despair, and begin to think about my family, my community in light of that tension, so that I can embrace the desolation, knowing that there's both consolations and desolations in my community. So that'd be one thing that take away, looking at hope and despair in tension with each other and not an either or thing, but one that it's where God is deeply vested in both of those to give us life. So next week, our theme is the call to discernment and proclamation, the next two. And again, if it's okay with Christina, with you and Jeremy, we'll start again by letting people ask any questions that they have from today's episode as they reflect this week and pick up the story again and the presentations that you've put together. So thank you again, Christina and Jeremy, for your due diligence and the clarity by which you bring these ideas, stimulate our thinking and reflection. So everyone, we hope that you have a good week, and we look forward to seeing you next week here on our Zoom call. So farewell.
Thanks, Jack.
Thanks, everyone.